Oh my God, so this is real. I can't believe what I'm seeing.
There's a moment, just a moment, exactly 4.2 seconds long. In that moment, you realize your entire life is a lie. Not a small lie, not something you can rationalize or explain away. A lie so complete, so devastating, that it retroactively destroys every memory you thought was real. Every promise, every touch, every "I love you" whispered in the dark. In that moment, you're not a soldier anymore. You're not a captain. You're not decorated or respected or strong. You're just a man, standing in his own house, watching his wife's body intertwined with another man's. And you can't breathe. My name is John Raymond. I'm 38 years old. I've survived 8 bullets, 4 explosions, 1 landmine, and more combat operations than I'm allowed to discuss. I've kept men alive. I've made impossible decisions. I've done things that would break a normal person. But I wasn't prepared for this. Because the enemy on the battlefield is predictable. The enemy you bring home, they destroy you in ways you never see coming. And the worst part? I still don't know if my wife was a victim or a betrayer. This is the day my marriage ended. This is the day I became someone else. And this is a story about what happens when a quiet man, a man trained by the military to destroy threats with surgical precision, finally understands that the biggest threat to his life never wore a uniform. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you believe about love, loyalty, and what we're actually capable of when we're broken. This is my story. John Raymond had taught himself not to feel. At 38, after 9 years in military intelligence, he'd become a machine, efficient, disciplined, lethal when necessary. But machines don't suffer. Machines don't ache. Machines don't lie awake wondering if the woman waiting for them is still there. But underneath that uniform was a man who was very much still human, and that human was dying. They're in bed, sunlight streaming through cheap blinds. John is on active orders, deploying in 3 hours. Neither of them has slept. Instead, they've spent the entire night just touching, hands locked, bodies intertwined, trying to memorize the exact smell of each other, the exact feeling of skin against skin. "Don't go," Kimberly whispers, and she means it. She's not being dramatic. She's terrified. John is terrified too, but he's learned to hide it. "I have to," he says, pressing her forehead against hers. "Then don't come back," she says. "What?" "If you're going to die anyway," she says, "just don't come back. Don't make me wait for a ghost." John pulls back to look at her. Her eyes are flooded with tears. She's young, only 26, and she's realizing that marriage isn't going to be what she thought it was. It's not going to be champagne and date nights. It's going to be loneliness and fear, and the constant terror that one phone call will change everything. "I will always come home," John says, and he means it so completely that he almost believes it himself. "I promise you, Kimberly, no matter what happens, I will always find my way back to you." She kisses him then, desperately, like she can transfer the feeling into him, like she can keep a piece of him with her while he's gone. "I love you so much," she whispers. "I know," he says, "and I love you. That's going to keep me alive out there. That's going to be the thing that brings me home." He kept that promise. Every deployment he came home, injured sometimes, changed always, but he came home. What John didn't realize was that coming home wasn't enough. Not anymore. It's 2:47 a.m. in a classified location in Pakistan. John is studying intelligence files in an operations center, surrounded by screens showing real-time surveillance feeds. He's 37 now, worn down. The weight of 9 years is visible in his face, the tightness around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. There's a photograph taped to the corner of his desk. Kimberly, From 6 years ago, she's laughing, completely unself-conscious, completely alive. He touches the image sometimes, just to remember what her skin felt like. It's becoming harder to remember. An analyst walks past. "You good, Captain?" "Yeah," John says. But he's not good. He's empty. He's been running on fumes for years, and he didn't realize it until right now. His phone buzzes. A text from Kimberly. "Can't sleep, thinking about you, miss you." It's 3 a.m. on the East Coast. She should be sleeping. The fact that she's awake, that she's missing him this much, creates a sharp pain in his chest. He texts back, "1 more month, then we talk about retirement." She responds immediately, "Please mean it this time." He's promised this before. He's broken that promise before. But this time, he means it, because he's finally figured out the horrible truth. Coming home isn't the same as being home, and Kimberly can't wait anymore. Neither can he.
John didn't know it then, but his time was already running out. The clock was ticking in ways he couldn't measure. His wife was drowning. She was reaching out for air, and the next person who offered her a breath of oxygen was going to own her completely. John didn't know this because he was 5,000 miles away, staring at a photograph of a woman he was losing, while that woman was losing him. Neither of them knew that the timer had already started. Kimberly Raymond was disappearing. Not literally. She still went to work, she still smiled, she still pretended that everything was fine. But the real her, the woman who laughed freely, who dreamed about the future, who believed in forever, that woman was fading away like a watercolor left in the rain. She was 35, still beautiful, still smart, still everything that should matter. But beauty can't cure loneliness. Intelligence can't fill an empty bed. Success at work can't replace the feeling of being chosen. At 3 a.m., alone in the house John bought with promises of forever, Kimberly would sometimes just sit in the dark, not crying, not sleeping, just existing in the emptiness, trying to understand when she'd stopped mattering. The charity gala was at the Arlington Ritz-Carlton, October, 6 weeks before John's deployment was supposed to end. Kimberly went because her friend Tanya insisted, "You need to get out. You need to remember who you are outside of waiting for someone." So she put on a black Valentino dress, the one she'd bought for New Year's Eve 3 years ago and had never worn. It cost too much. It was too sexy. It wasn't the kind of thing a military wife wore. But tonight, she wasn't a military wife. Tonight, she was just a woman. And she was starving. Alexander Stone was 42, wealthy beyond measure, and possessed a kind of power that came from always getting what he wanted. He wore a custom Brioni suit that probably cost more than Kimberly's car. His watch, a Patek Philippe Nautilus, was a 6-figure statement of casual dominance. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His smile was practiced, but effective. Most importantly, he was used to hunting, and he recognized prey when he saw it. He watched Kimberly at the bar for exactly 3 minutes before moving in. He'd learned the art of seduction by studying human psychology, by understanding vulnerability, by seeing women not as people, but as problems to be solved. Kimberly was wearing the look of someone slowly disappearing. He knew that look. He'd seen it before. It was the look of someone who would do anything, absolutely anything, to feel alive again. "That dress," he said, appearing beside her like he'd been summoned, "belongs on someone who actually appreciates being appreciated. You look like you're here against your will." Kimberly should have walked away. A part of her recognized the danger, but a bigger part of her, the part that hadn't been touched by her husband in 4 months, that hadn't been looked at like she mattered in years, that part wanted to hear more. "I'm here," she said, "because my friend thought I needed to remember who I am." Alexander smiled. It was a smile that contained infinite confidence. "And who are you?" "I used to know," Kimberly said, and the honest sadness in her voice sealed it. He'd found his target.
"I'm Alexander Stone," he said, extending his hand, "and I make it a point to always know exactly who someone is, starting with beautiful women who look like they're being haunted by their own lives." She shouldn't have shaken his hand, but she did. That single gesture, that one moment of engagement instead of rejection, would eventually destroy 3 lives. Over the next 6 weeks, Alexander methodically dismantled Kimberly's remaining defenses. He didn't sleep with her immediately. That would be crude. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He paid attention to her. He'd accidentally run into her at the coffee shop she frequented every Tuesday morning. He'd text her at night when she couldn't sleep, knowing that John wouldn't be around to notice. He'd ask her about her day, her dreams, her fears, the kinds of questions John had stopped asking years ago. He sent her flowers at work, a single calla lily, expensive and elegant, with a card that read, "Someone should be appreciating you." He showed her photographs of his penthouse in Arlington, floor-to-ceiling windows, expensive art, a view of the city that made you feel like you were above the rest of the world. Most importantly, he made her feel like she mattered again. 6 weeks into his campaign, Alexander sent her a text. "Your husband is in Pakistan. You're in Arlington. That's not a marriage. That's a subscription service that keeps canceling on you." Kimberly stared at that text for 20 minutes. Every word was a knife, and every word was true. She called him. Her hands were shaking. "I can't see you," she said. "Why not?" Alexander asked, and his voice was so calm, so confident, so certain that she would eventually say yes. "Because I'm married." "To a ghost," Alexander said. "You're married to a man who's chosen his country over you 9 years in a row. You're married to a man who's going to miss your life while he's building someone else's future. That's not marriage, Kimberly. That's just waiting." She hung up, but she didn't block his number. And 3 days later, she texted him back. "One time, that's all. One time to remember what it feels like to matter." He responded immediately. "Perfect. I'll have it arranged." Kimberly would later wonder if Alexander had planned this from the beginning, if she was just another trophy, another way to prove his power, because the truth was he didn't just seduce her into his bed, he seduced her into his world. And once you're inside Alexander Stone's world, there's no going back to normal. The first time they kissed, Kimberly felt like she was drowning and being saved simultaneously. It was in the penthouse. Alexander had rented the entire top floor of the Ritz-Carlton for a private event. They were alone. The city was sprawling below them like 1,000 glittering diamonds. He touched her face like he was carefully examining something precious. Then he kissed her, not with passion, but with ownership. When they made love, it felt like the first time she'd ever been touched. Afterward, lying in his bed with the city lights casting shadows across his chest, she cried silently while he slept. She wasn't crying from pleasure. She was crying from self-hatred. What had she done? Over the next 8 months, Kimberly became a different person. She developed a second phone, a burner that Alexander bought for her. She created lies with the precision of a criminal. Late meetings, girls' nights, weekend conferences. She had a secondary credit card. She had a secondary email address. She became someone she didn't recognize. Alexander controlled her with brilliant subtlety. He never hit her, never raised his voice. Instead, he'd say things like, "You deserve better than this," and "Your husband is lucky you're not leaving him," and "I could give you a life where you don't wake up alone." He gave her gifts, a diamond bracelet, an Hermes bag, a Cartier watch. Each gift was a brick in a wall between her and her old life. More insidiously, he showed her his world. He took her to restaurants where the owner greeted him with fear-tinged deference. He introduced her to people in his circle, wealthy men, politicians, people with power that came from connections that went deep into the criminal underworld. She saw the respect he commanded, the fear, the way powerful men bent toward him like he was the gravity around which their worlds orbited. And she felt seen, chosen, special. Kimberly didn't fully understand Alexander's world. She knew he was wealthy, but she didn't understand how he'd made his money. She caught fragments, conversations about moving product, dealing with a situation, making sure someone understands. She saw him have urgent calls where his voice would go cold and dangerous in ways that made her understand he wasn't a businessman. He was something far more powerful and infinitely more terrifying. But by the time she truly understood, she was in too deep. One night, they were at his penthouse. Alexander was in his office making calls. Kimberly was in the living room scrolling through news when she saw it. A headline: Federal Task Force investigating major crime boss for money laundering. Attached to the article was a photograph: Alexander Stone. Her blood went cold. She clicked on the article and read that Alexander was being investigated for connections to organized crime, human trafficking, and political corruption. Law enforcement was calling him one of the most dangerous figures in the East Coast criminal underworld. The article went on to say that, despite overwhelming evidence, Alexander had managed to avoid prosecution for 15 years due to his connections with corrupted officials and his ability to eliminate or intimidate witnesses. Kimberly felt the floor shift beneath her. She heard Alexander coming and quickly closed the article. "What are you looking at?" he asked, and his voice had changed. It was no longer warm. It was the voice of someone who needed to know if a threat had been identified. "Nothing," she lied. "Just news." He came around and looked at her screen. It was blank. He studied her face for a long moment, and she understood in that moment that Alexander wasn't someone to be lied to, that he was capable of things she couldn't imagine. "Come here," he said softly. She stood. He pulled her close. He kissed her forehead. "You're mine now," he whispered. "Completely mine. Do you understand that?" It wasn't a question.
October 12th, 3:47 p.m. John Raymond's deployment was officially over. He'd texted Kimberly 3 days ago, "Coming home Tuesday, taking a cab from the airport, see you at home." She hadn't responded, which was unusual, but John had learned not to expect much from those conversations anymore. The flight from Islamabad to D.C. was 14 hours. John sat in business class, a privilege that came with his rank, and stared out the window at the clouds below. He was emotionally numb. That was his default state these days. Numb was safe. Numb kept you moving forward. But underneath the numbness was an ocean of terror. What if she'd left him? What if she'd finally had enough and found someone else? What if coming home meant coming home to an empty house? He pulled out his phone. The photograph of Kimberly was still there, but it felt ancient now. He barely remembered what her laugh sounded like. The Uber dropped him at his house at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. The driveway was empty. Kimberly's car wasn't there. His first thought, she's not home. Relief mixed with disappointment. He used his key. The house was quiet. Too quiet. "Kimberly?" he called out. No answer. He set his duffel bag by the door. The house looked immaculate, almost like it was staged for sale. No personal touches, no life, just emptiness. He went upstairs, thinking maybe she was sleeping or in the shower. That's when he saw it. 2 wine glasses on the coffee table. One had a lipstick stain on the rim. The color was deep red, a shade Kimberly had never worn. His body went cold. There's a specific moment, exactly 4.2 seconds, where everything changes, where your brain catches up to what your instincts already know, where possibility becomes certainty. John stood in that living room for those 4.2 seconds. In those 4.2 seconds, he understood that his wife was not faithful, that she'd betrayed him, that someone else had been in his house, had touched what was his, had desecrated the one thing he'd been fighting to protect. In those 4.2 seconds, something died inside him. What was born in its place was something far more dangerous. He walked upstairs slowly, deliberately. Each step was controlled, measured, his military training kicking in, identifying the threat, assessing the situation, preparing for engagement. The bedroom door was open, and there, in the center of their bed, the bed where they'd promised forever, was his wife, completely naked, completely engaged, with a man John had never seen. It took them exactly 2.3 seconds to notice him. Kimberly's eyes went from ecstatic to mortified to absolutely destroyed in a fraction of a second. She opened her mouth to scream, to explain, to do something, but John already knew everything he needed to know. The man underneath her scrambled away, reaching for his clothes. He was handsome in that expensive, dangerous way, confident, arrogant, like someone who'd never experienced real consequences in his entire life. "Captain Raymond, I presume?" the man said, naked, completely unconcerned. "I'm Alexander Stone. Your wife is my—" John didn't hear the rest. He simply turned and walked downstairs. Behind him, he heard screaming. He heard Kimberly calling his name, heard Alexander's footsteps coming down the stairs, heard him getting dressed like this was some kind of inconvenience.
John sat on the couch, the same couch where he'd once held Kimberly while she cried about missing him, and he didn't move. Alexander came down, fully dressed now, and had the audacity to speak to him. "Look," Alexander said, his voice carrying that obnoxious confidence, "I understand this looks bad, but Kimberly and I, we have something. She was lonely. She needed someone who could actually be there for her. I've taken better care of her in 6 months than you have in 9 years." John didn't respond. He didn't move. He didn't even look at the man. What he was doing was something far more important. He was remembering. He was remembering every moment in that marriage, every deployment, every night he'd woken up scared and held her photograph, every promise he'd made, every sacrifice. And he was understanding with perfect clarity that he'd married a woman who couldn't keep a simple promise, that everything he'd been fighting for didn't actually exist. "Get out," John said quietly. "What?" Alexander asked, like he hadn't heard correctly. "Get out," John repeated, "of my house, now." Alexander laughed. He actually laughed, like John was a child who'd tried to threaten him. "You're a soldier," Alexander said dismissively. "You probably kill people for a living. So let me explain something to you. I've got judges in my pocket. I've got federal agents on my payroll. I've got a network of people who would disappear you without a second thought. So whatever you're thinking of doing right now, I'd strongly advise against it." John finally looked at him, and in that look, Alexander Stone made his first and most critical mistake. He saw a broken man. He saw someone who was hurting. He saw weakness. What he didn't see was a soldier whose entire life had been defined by strategy, whose mind was already 3 moves ahead, whose training had prepared him for exactly this kind of threat assessment. "You have 10 seconds, John said calmly, "to leave." Alexander left, whistling, completely confident that this situation was handled, completely unaware that he'd just painted a target on himself. He had no idea what John Raymond was capable of when he stopped playing by civilian rules. In that moment, watching Alexander Stone walk out of his house, completely untouched, completely confident, John made a decision. He wasn't going to kill him. Killing was too simple, too quick, too merciful. He was going to dismantle him,
piece by piece, life by life, until Alexander Stone understood that there are fates far worse than death. Kimberly came downstairs wearing John's dress shirt, her body shaking, tears streaming down her face. "John, please, let me explain. I was lonely. I was scared. John held up his hand. "Don't," he said. His voice was so empty, so devoid of emotion, that it was worse than any rage could have been. "But you have to understand," Kimberly tried. "I said, don't," John repeated. He stood up. He looked at his wife, really looked at her, and he saw a stranger. He saw the woman he loved, yes, but he also saw someone capable of complete betrayal. Someone who, when given a choice between standing by her marriage and chasing comfort, chose comfort. "Pack a bag, leave." "John, please." "I can't look at you right now," his voice hollow. "I can't be in this house with you. Just go." "Where am I supposed to go?" "I don't care," he said, and that was the cruelest part. Not that he was angry, but that he genuinely didn't care anymore. That she'd successfully made herself irrelevant to his emotional landscape. She packed a bag, crying the entire time. She tried to touch him. She tried to explain. She begged for forgiveness. And John just sat in silence, waiting for her to leave. When she finally did, he sat alone in that empty house, in the dark, and something inside him shifted. The pain was still there, a crushing, suffocating pain that made breathing difficult. But underneath it was something else, a cold, calculated need for justice. Over the next 2 weeks, John barely left the house. He called his CO and took 2 weeks of emergency leave, something he'd never done in 9 years of service. He didn't tell them about Kimberly. He didn't tell anyone. Instead, he systematized his pain. He made a list. Alexander Stone. Then he made another list of everyone he knew who had skills that could be useful. Former NSA analyst, FBI contact, private investigator, military intelligence colleagues. Then he made a plan, not out of rage. Rage was inefficient, but out of something colder and far more dangerous, clarity. John realized that Alexander Stone had made an assumption. He'd seen a broken man and assumed weakness. What Alexander didn't know was that John had been trained by the United States military to identify threats, analyze vulnerabilities, and execute complex operations under impossible pressure. What Alexander didn't know was that John wasn't a grieving husband anymore. He was a weapon, and he'd finally identified his target. John made one phone call. That's all it took. He called an old friend from his military intelligence days, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd left the CIA to start a private investigation firm. He didn't explain everything. He just said, "I need a background check on Alexander Stone. Everything. Criminal connections, financial records, associates, weaknesses." Sarah responded, "That name came up in an FBI task force meeting last month. Whatever you're doing, John, be careful. Just get me the information," he said. What John received 48 hours later was a revelation. Alexander Stone wasn't just a successful businessman. He was the lieutenant to one of the largest crime organizations on the East Coast. He was involved in money laundering, human trafficking, contract killing, and political corruption. He'd been under federal investigation for 5 years, and the FBI was close, very close, to bringing charges. But there was a problem. Witnesses kept disappearing or recanting their stories. Evidence kept getting lost. Judges who were supposed to rule against him instead ruled in his favor. Alexander had built an empire of corruption so extensive that traditional law enforcement couldn't touch him. But traditional law enforcement wasn't John's style anyway. John dug deeper and discovered something that made even him uncomfortable. Alexander had a daughter, 12 years old, with a woman named Michelle Valdez, who worked at a high-end spa. Alexander paid for the girl's private school in Switzerland, but had never actually met her, never held her, never acknowledged her publicly. The girl's name was Sophia. She was completely protected, completely hidden, and completely vulnerable if someone decided to use her as leverage. John made a note. Leverage. John's investigation revealed that Alexander had a business partner named Marcus Webb, another crime boss, another trafficker, another murderer. But their partnership was fracturing.
Marcus believed Alexander was skimming money from their joint operations. Millions of dollars. Missing. Unaccounted for. The FBI had intercepted conversations where Marcus was becoming increasingly paranoid and aggressive. There was talk of solving the Alexander problem. In other words, there was about to be a war between two dangerous men. John just needed to ignite it. Through his FBI contact, John discovered that there was a federal task force specifically focused on Alexander Stone. Dozens of agents, years of work, thousands of pages of evidence. But they were stuck. They needed a credible witness, someone close to Alexander, someone who could provide testimony that would stand up in court and survive cross-examination, someone like a mistress or a wife. John saw an opportunity forming. Over the next 6 weeks, John implemented his plan with the precision of a military operation. He anonymously tipped off Marcus Webb about financial discrepancies in their accounts. He provided fabricated documents that made it look like Alexander was stealing from him. He made sure the information came from sources that Marcus would trust. Marcus became paranoid, then angry, then dangerous. He started calling Alexander, making threats, demanding answers. Alexander, not understanding that he was being manipulated, became defensive and aggressive in return. The partnership that had lasted 15 years was on the verge of complete collapse. Then John made his second move. John hired Sarah Chen to set up a situation. They created fake email evidence. They forged documents. They did things that walked the line between legal and illegal, but were worth the risk. Sarah managed to get both Alexander and Marcus to agree to meet, a private restaurant in Washington, D.C., supposedly to discuss their concerns. John arranged for the meeting to be recorded, not by him directly, that would be too obvious, but through a federal contact who could make it official and admissible. Then John waited. The restaurant was upscale, private, the kind of place where dangerous men felt safe. Marcus arrived first, angry and suspicious. Alexander arrived 10 minutes later, confident and dismissive. What happened next was captured on federal recording equipment. "Where's our money, Alex? Where's the $4.2 million? "I don't know what you're talking about. You think I'm stupid? I know you're moving accounts. I know you're planning to cut me out." "You're paranoid, Marcus. You're becoming unstable. Maybe it's time for you to step back." "Step back? I built this empire with you. I bled for this organization. And you're stealing from us?" "You're stealing. Marcus, I generate more revenue than anyone in our operation combined. If anyone's stealing, it's all of you. I could eliminate this entire problem by tomorrow if I wanted to. Try it. See what happens." "You want to see what happens? You want me to show you? Because I can. I've disappeared 3 people this year alone, people with families, people with no idea what hit them. You think you're a threat to me? You're a problem, and problems get solved." In that recording, Alexander Stone admitted to 3 murders. He admitted to extortion, trafficking, and political corruption. He admitted to everything the FBI needed. But more importantly, he admitted that he was willing to kill Marcus. And Marcus, hearing that threat, understood that his partner was no longer an ally. He was a predator. John delivered the recording to his FBI contact anonymously, through a dead drop, no names, no connections. Within 48 hours, the FBI had enough to bring charges. They arrested Alexander Stone at his penthouse.
But before they did, John made sure he saw it happen. He positioned himself across the street as FBI agents descended on the building.
He watched as a man who'd seemed invincible, who'd carried himself with the confidence of someone untouchable, was let out in handcuffs. Alexander's face went white when he saw John standing across the street. In that moment, Alexander understood. He'd been hunted. He'd been outmaneuvered. He'd been destroyed by the very man he'd dismissed as a grieving, broken husband. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds, and John smiled. It was the smile of a soldier who'd completed his mission. But the prosecution hit a problem. Without Alexander alive and free, without the possibility of him killing Marcus, Marcus began to think. He realized he'd been played. He realized that someone had created this situation specifically to turn him and Alexander against each other. Marcus went to the FBI and made a deal, full cooperation in exchange for witness protection. He revealed that Alexander's organization was even more extensive than anyone had realized. He revealed that Alexander had personally ordered the murder of at least 6 people. But more explosively, he revealed something about Kimberly. Alexander had been planning to use Kimberly. Marcus revealed that Alexander was keeping detailed records of his affair with Kimberly, photographs, videos, intimate details. He was building a file on her specifically so that if John ever became a threat, he could destroy Kimberly's reputation. He could use her as leverage. He could make her disappear if necessary. Kimberly wasn't just his mistress. She was going to be his contingency plan. John learned about this while he was watching Alexander's penthouse being searched by federal agents. When he heard what they'd found, videos of his wife, recordings of her, evidence of his plan to use her as a tool, something broke inside him. He realized that Kimberly wasn't just a betrayer, she was also a victim. John called Kimberly for the first time in weeks. She answered on the first ring, like she'd been waiting for him to call. "John," she whispered. The FBI found recordings, videos, evidence that Alexander was planning to use you, that he was keeping files on you to use as leverage. Silence. He was going to destroy you, Kimberly. He was going to erase you completely if I ever became too much of a threat to him. You weren't his lover. You were his insurance policy. "I know," she whispered. "I told him. 3 months ago. He said if I ever tried to leave, or if I ever went to the authorities, he'd release the videos. He'd destroy my career. He'd destroy my life." "So why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because I was terrified," she said, and her voice broke. "Because I realized what I'd done, and I couldn't undo it. Because I was trapped between my betrayal of you and my terror of him." John didn't respond. "I'm sorry, John. I'm so sorry, John. I don't expect forgiveness. I need you to know that I never loved him, not for a second. I loved the way he made me feel wanted, but I never loved him."
Alexander Stone was convicted on 15 counts. Federal prison, 27 years, no parole. Marcus Webb received 18 years in exchange for his cooperation. Kimberly moved to California to rebuild her life. She entered therapy. She learned to live with her guilt and her trauma. And John had to figure out who he was now that his revenge was complete. 3 months after Alexander's conviction, John sat in a coffee shop with Kimberly, not to reconcile, not to forgive, but to finally have an honest conversation. "I systematically destroyed him," John said. "I made sure that every plan he had, every contingency, every safety net I could identify, I dismantled it. I used federal agencies as weapons. I turned his partner against him. I made sure he understood that he was being hunted by someone he'd completely underestimated." "I know," Kimberly said quietly. "And I don't regret it," John continued. "But I also realize that I lost myself in the process. I became someone who measured success in destroyed lives. I became exactly what I was trying to fight against. "You were hurt," Kimberly said. "I was betrayed," John corrected, "and that betrayal exposed something I didn't want to see about myself, that my capacity for control, for manipulation, for strategic thinking, it's not something I can just turn off. It's not a tool I can put down and pretend isn't there." Kimberly reached across the table and put her hand on his. "I can't forgive you for what happened. I don't think I ever will. But I want you to understand that I also can't forgive myself for how I responded. We both failed each other. I abandoned you through deployment. You abandoned me through betrayal. And the saddest part is, we were both doing it for the same reason." "What reason?" Kimberly asked. "Because we were both lonely, and loneliness makes you do terrible things." The last time John saw Kimberly, she looked different, not physically, but spiritually, like she was learning to exist again. They didn't get back together. Some wounds are too deep. Some betrayals are too profound. Some relationships don't survive what theirs survived. But they did something perhaps more important than reconciliation. They became honest. John left the army 6 months after Alexander's conviction. After 9 years of service, after multiple deployments, after becoming one of the most decorated intelligence officers of his generation, he simply stopped. He realized that the military had trained him to destroy. It had taught him to compartmentalize, to strategize, to turn human beings into problems to be solved. And when that training went inward, when he pointed it at his own life, it had made him someone he didn't recognize. He'd spent 9 years telling himself that duty was more important than presence.
That honor was worth sacrificing love. That keeping his country safe mattered more than keeping his marriage intact. But sitting alone in an apartment in Arlington, watching Alexander Stone's conviction being discussed on the news, John understood something he'd been avoiding. There is no victory without sacrifice, but there is also no victory if the sacrifice is so complete that you lose yourself in the process. John realized that the real enemy wasn't Alexander Stone. Alexander was just a symptom, a manifestation of a larger problem. A man who'd learned that power came from hurting people, from manipulating systems, from treating human beings like game pieces. John realized that he'd become the same thing. He'd systematically disassembled Alexander Stone's life. Yes, Alexander had committed crimes. Yes, Alexander had seduced his wife. Yes, Alexander deserved legal consequences. But John had used federal agencies as weapons. He'd manipulated federal investigators. He'd turned Marcus Webb into a tool. He'd orchestrated everything with the kind of precision that came from deep training in psychological warfare. He'd become the thing he despised. John stood at a crossroads. He could stay in the military. He could use his skills for the government. He could tell himself that serving his country was more important than healing his own life. Or he could choose something harder. He could choose to be human again. He could choose to be vulnerable again. He could choose to admit that he was broken and actually work on fixing it instead of compartmentalizing it. He chose the latter. John started therapy with a specialist in trauma and PTSD. He opened up about the deployments, about the things he'd seen, about the ways the military had changed him, about how he'd married a woman and then slowly abandoned her through absence. He worked at a consulting firm, using his skills to help corporations identify security threats. It was meaningful work without the moral complexity of military service. It paid well. It allowed him to sleep. He went to the gym. He took long walks. He read books. He did the small human things that he'd stopped doing while he was deployed. And slowly, very slowly, he began to recognize himself again. 1 year after Alexander's conviction, John received a letter. It was from Alexander, from federal prison. John almost threw it away, but something made him open it. "John," it read, "I'm writing this knowing you probably won't read it, but I need to say this anyway. I've had a lot of time to think in here, and I've realized something. I underestimated you. I saw a broken man and assumed weakness. I didn't understand that the most dangerous men are the ones who have nothing left to lose, the ones who've already accepted their own destruction. You were willing to destroy yourself to destroy me, and somehow that made you invincible. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I need you to know you won. You won so completely that I'm not sure there's a version of me that survives this prison sentence. You didn't just put me in prison, you erased who I was. And the worst part is, I deserve it. I'm sorry. Alexander Stone."
John read that letter 3 times, and something shifted in him. He realized that revenge, when complete, doesn't feel like victory. It feels like hollowness. It feels like you've destroyed something so thoroughly that you've destroyed a piece of yourself in the process. Here's what this story's really about. It's not about a soldier who defeated a criminal. It's not about a wife who betrayed her husband. It's not even about the criminal who got what he deserved. It's about what happens when people are lonely, when people are desperate, when people stop seeing each other as human beings and start seeing each other as problems to be solved or vacuums to be filled. John Raymond was lonely in a desert thousands of miles away from his wife. Kimberly was lonely in a house full of memories that had become unbearable. Alexander was lonely in his penthouse, a man so powerful and so feared that he could never actually trust anyone. And because of that loneliness, 3 lives were destroyed. The real lesson isn't about betrayal or revenge or justice. It's about what we lose when we stop being present, when we choose duty over love, when we choose comfort over honesty, when we choose power over connection. John Raymond learned that the hard way. John sits on the balcony of his apartment, watching the sun set over Arlington. He's not happy, not yet, but he's no longer angry. He's no longer at war. His phone buzzes. A text from Sarah Chen, the investigator who helped him bring down Alexander. The appeal was denied. He's going to serve the full sentence. John doesn't celebrate. He doesn't feel anything at all. The victory he'd imagined would feel like relief. Instead, it just feels like closure. And closure, he's learning, is not the same as peace. He thinks about Kimberly, probably in California, probably in therapy, probably learning to live with her choices the way he's learning to live with his. He thinks about Alexander in a federal prison cell, probably rereading his letter, probably understanding too late that the real prison was always going to be himself. And he understands, finally, what the deepest truth of this entire story is. The strongest person in the world is never the one with the most power. It's the one who's been broken and chooses to heal anyway. It's the one who's been betrayed and chooses forgiveness. It's the one who's been the villain and chooses to become human again. John Raymond is learning to be that person. It's harder than any battle he fought overseas. It's more important than any mission he ever completed. And it's the only victory that actually matters. John receives a call from Kimberly. They've been texting occasionally, not romantically, but with genuine care. Real friendship building from the ashes of failed marriage. "I got engaged," she says quietly. John feels a moment of something. Not jealousy, not exactly. Maybe grief.
the grief of what could have been. "That's good," he says, "and he means it. He better treat you right." "He does," Kimberly says. "He's a therapist. He understands damage. He understands healing." They talk for a few more minutes, and when John hangs up, he feels something he hasn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the peace of victory, but the peace of finally letting go.
Please like and subscribe.